My name is Cal Riggins, and after 20 years in the Army, you'd think nothing would rattle me anymore. Not loud orders, not chaos, not people trying to push you past your limit. But what I didn't expect when I moved into that little cul-de-sac in Sutter Pines was that the person who'd test me the most wouldn't be an enemy in uniform. It'd be my new neighbor in pearls. Her name was Marla Denning, the HOA president. The kind of woman who carried herself like the sun rose because she signed off on it. She was polished, always in pressed linen, always smiling in that tight, smug way that said she had memorized every rule in the handbook, and secretly believed none of them applied to her. When I bought the house, I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted quiet. Stability. A place to plant roots after decades of deployment and rotation, a backyard with space for my dog, a driveway for my truck, and a porch where I could drink coffee without needing to scan the horizon. I thought I'd earned that. But Marla made it clear on day one that peace would be something I had to request, and she was the one stamping the forms. The first meeting she called me to wasn't even a week after I moved in. She rang my doorbell at 6:45 a.m., clipboard in hand, smiling like she was on a magazine cover. "Just a little welcome," she chirped, "and a few reminders about our community guidelines." She pointed to my flagpole, said it was 2 inches taller than regulation. Then she motioned toward my truck. "We like to keep the neighborhood looking tidy, Mr. Riggins," she said, voice dripping with condescension. Oversized vehicles can give a rugged impression. I told her I'd served 20 years, that the flag stayed, and that the truck wasn't moving. Her smile didn't waver. "We'll see," she replied, and just like that, the games began. Over the next few weeks, I got warnings about non-compliant landscaping, improper curtain colors, even a notice about the dog bowl on my porch. I fixed what I had to, ignored what I didn't, and tried not to let it get under my skin, but Marla wasn't just enforcing rules, she was building a case. She didn't want me to comply, she wanted me to crack. Then came the incident with the generator. There was a thunderstorm, power went out across the block. I rolled out the portable unit I'd bought back in Fayetteville, set it up behind my garage, and let it run through the night to keep the fridge cold and my CPAP running. The next morning, I woke up to find a citation taped to my window. Unauthorized equipment, noise violation, property disruption. I stood there on my porch in the rain, holding the paper, heart pounding, not because I was afraid, but because I could feel something shifting. Marla wasn't just trying to control the neighborhood, she was targeting me. I was the wrong kind of resident in her perfect little picture. And the worst part? People started to believe her version of things. I noticed neighbors whispering, looking away. I waved at someone walking their dog and they crossed the street. It was happening quietly like erosion, and I realized then this wasn't about noise. It wasn't about rules, it was about power. And I'd spent too long earning mine to let her strip it away because she didn't like the way I parked. But the moment it all exploded didn't come with a warning. It came during the HOA meeting the following month. I didn't want to go, but I needed to face it head on. I sat in the back, arms crossed, listening while Marla read through the minutes like she was commanding a courtroom. Then she opened the floor to grievances, and I stood. I spoke clearly, respectfully. Even cited the bylaws she claimed I'd violated. She cut me off 3 times. Then, when I said, "With all due respect, ma'am, I've defended this country for 2 decades. I know how to follow rules when they're fair," she slammed her gavel and told me to sit down. I didn't. I said calmly, You don't intimidate me." And that's when she walked toward me, heels clicking, face flushed, and slapped me. Open palm, hard. The room gasped. Someone stood. I didn't move. I looked her in the eye and said that was a mistake. And she, red-faced and shaking, shouted, "You can't arrest me! I run this neighborhood!" The silence after that was the kind you only hear when something irreversible has just happened, and I knew right then Marla had finally crossed the line she'd spent months drawing around me. The slap didn't sting, not physically. But something else did, something deeper. It was the silence after, the frozen faces, the fact that no one moved, no one said a word, like they were waiting to see what I'd do. I didn't raise my voice, didn't take a step forward. I just stood there staring at a woman who had mistaken her clipboard for a badge and her self-importance for authority. Marla's face was flushed. Whether with embarrassment, rage, or fear, I couldn't tell. All I knew was that she'd crossed a line she couldn't walk back from. One of the board members, a woman named Hazel, finally broke the tension. That's enough, she said, her voice trembling. We're calling the police. Marla turned toward her sharply. No, we are not. I'm the acting authority here. This is a private matter. But it was too late. Another board member was already on the phone. Marla kept pacing in front of the folding table like a cornered animal, muttering about how things were being blown out of proportion. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The sound of sirens in the distance spoke for me. By the time the officers arrived, Marla was seated again, trying to act composed. She looked up as they entered and smiled tightly, that same brittle charm she'd used on me the first day. Officers, she said, thank you for coming. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. One of the officers, a stocky guy with a kind but no-nonsense face, raised a brow. Sir, are you the one who was struck? I nodded. Yes. In front of the entire room. They asked if I wanted to press charges. I didn't even hesitate. Yes, I said. I do. That cracked the performance. Marla shot to her feet. You can't be serious. I was provoked. He refused to yield the floor. He's disruptive. The officer calmly asked everyone in the room if they had witnessed the incident. Almost every hand went up. That was when I saw it. The panic in her eyes. For the first time since I met her, Marla Denning realized she didn't control the room. And then she said the line that would seal her fate. I'm the HOA President. You can't arrest me. You don't have the authority. The officer looked at her evenly. Ma'am, that's not how the law works. They didn't cuff her, not then, but they did walk her outside, took her statement, and opened an official report. I stayed behind, letting them do their job. Hazel came over and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. I'm sorry it got this far, she whispered. We should have stopped it sooner. I nodded but didn't say anything. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones when you realize you've been trying to live quietly and still ended up in someone else's war. That night, I got a call from the officer who took the report. He said they'd submitted the incident to the city attorney and it would likely move forward. It may just be a misdemeanor assault, he explained, but the pattern of behavior here, there's more going on. I thanked him and hung up, then sat in the dark, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator. No music. No TV. Just the stillness. I'd had quieter nights on base, less tense stares in a war zone. And the saddest part? I hadn't raised my voice once, and yet somehow, I was still the one made to feel like I didn't belong. The next day, the neighborhood felt different. The air was heavy with gossip, but no one said anything to my face. Some neighbors nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact altogether. One man, Rick, from 3 houses down, came over in the afternoon with a 6-pack and stood on my porch in awkward silence until I invited him in. Didn't know it was that bad, he said quietly. Figured it was just HOA politics, power trips. I didn't know she'd go that far. I appreciated the gesture, but I didn't feel like talking about it. Instead, we drank a couple of beers in silence, watched a football game neither of us were really invested in, and he left just before sunset. I sat on the porch after he left, watching the sky shift into that soft orange you only get in early fall. I thought about all the places I'd been stationed, the men I served with, the rules we followed, the discipline, and how strange it was that in all that time, no one had ever slapped me for standing my ground. But I come home, try to live peacefully, and it takes one HOA meeting to turn my life into a headline. I wasn't going to let that be the end. Not here, not now. I woke up to find my face on the community Facebook page, not a photo of me, thankfully, just my name and a vague status posted in the HOA group Marla used to control like a digital throne. It saddens me that recent misunderstandings have escalated to legal action, it read. I've always worked to uphold the values of Sutter Pines. It's unfortunate that some people mistake accountability for aggression. No names, no specifics, just enough smoke to suggest there'd been a fire and that I had started it. Within hours, there were comments, a few well-meaning, many not. People I'd never spoken to were suddenly using phrases like disruptive energy and aggressive behavior. I scrolled through the thread, jaw clenched. The slap was real, the police report was real, but in the court of public opinion, truth had to compete with presentation, and Marla had mastered hers for years. Still, I didn't respond. Not online, not in the group, not even when someone posted, "Wasn't he military? That explains a lot." I'd survived worse than gossip, and if this neighborhood wanted a show, I wasn't giving him a free one. What I didn't expect was the phone call from the local news station. A woman named Kendall left a message on my voicemail. We're following a developing story about a local HOA dispute involving reported assault. We'd like to speak with you on the record. I didn't return the call, but by evening I saw the segment air anyway. A blurry photo of Marla walking out of the community center played over vague narration. An altercation at a recent HOA meeting in Sutter Pines has raised questions about leadership conduct and community standards. A retired Army veteran filed a police report citing harassment and physical assault. No names, no faces, just suggestion. I recognized the voiceover strategy: soft framing, implied balance, and just enough controversy to stir viewers without committing to a side. I sat on the couch, in the dark, remote in hand, and watched the story fade into weather and sports. It didn't make me angry. It made me certain. Marla thought she could control the narrative like she controlled the bylaws, but she forgot something crucial. I didn't have to outtalk her. I just had to outlast her. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Marla wasn't present. The agenda was read by Hazel, whose hands visibly trembled while holding the notes. She didn't mention the incident, but people whispered. Eyes flicked to me when my name was mentioned. I sat through it all without speaking, until the very end when community questions were allowed. I raised my hand slowly. I have a statement to make, I said. Hazel nodded, hesitant. I stood up, not angry, not defensive, just steady. I didn't come here to fight. I moved here to live quietly, to grow roots after 20 years of service. I expected rules, yes, but fairness too, respect. What happened at the last meeting was not a misunderstanding. It was an escalation of a pattern, one many of you have witnessed. I won't let intimidation wear a smile and call itself leadership. The room went quiet. I met no one's eyes, just folded my paper and sat back down. No applause, no backlash, just tension. But this time, it wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the empty chair where Marla used to sit like a queen. By the end of the week, 2 board members had resigned, not publicly, but in private. Notices submitted to Hazel. I wasn't surprised. They had ridden her coattails long enough, and now the ride was breaking down. Hazel called to tell me the board would be appointing interim members until elections could be held. Would you consider serving, she asked. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was surreal. I didn't come here to govern, I said. I came here to rest. But she paused and said, maybe you're the only one who can do both. I didn't answer right away. That night, I walked the perimeter of my yard, flashlight in hand, checking the gate latches, the motion sensor, the flagpole bolts. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. And as I stood at the edge of my property, looking at the house I thought would be my quiet retreat, I realized something. Peace isn't just the absence of noise. Sometimes peace is the line you draw between you and the people who think they can break you. And from here on out, that line was going to stay firm, whether I was behind the table or standing alone in the back. A week after Hazel asked if I'd consider joining the HOA board, I found the official form folded under my front doormat. An appointment application with a sticky note in her handwriting, just in case. I left it on the kitchen table for 2 days without touching it. Not because I didn't know what to do with it, but because I did. Getting involvement, stepping into the spotlight I had avoided since coming home. In the Army, structure made sense. You knew who to follow and why. There was weight behind every command, rules you didn't argue with. But here, in this little manicured neighborhood with its ornamental trees and desperate brunches, power came from popularity and influence was often louder than truth. Still, something was shifting. Marla's seat stayed empty at every HOA meeting, and the people who used to sit near her had stopped wearing smiles so tight they squeaked. There was room now, room for something better or at least less poisonous. And if I didn't step up, someone else would. Someone quieter, someone easier to manipulate. I'd seen what happened when no one took charge, and I wasn't interested in watching this place rot from the inside out. So I submitted the form. I didn't tell anyone, not even Hazel. Just filled it out, signed it, and slid it through the HOA drop box like I was dropping off a letter to a stranger. The next morning, I received an email confirming my appointment as interim member. A second email welcomed me to the board. No fanfare, no applause, just a digital handshake and a PDF copy of the HOA bylaws. I spent that night reading every page, highlighting sections, scribbling notes in the margins. I didn't want to rule. I wanted to understand the weapon Marla had used to hurt people and turn it into a shield instead. That week, I attended my first board meeting from the front row. The chair creaked differently when I sat down. The room felt narrower somehow. Hazel looked relieved. The other 2 board members, fresh replacements, nodded cautiously. And the residents? They stared at me with something between curiosity and expectation. For once, I wasn't just the man who'd been slapped. I was the one who didn't flinch afterward. And maybe that mattered more. But Marla wasn't gone. Not really. Her name still lingered in committee emails. Her influence echoed in whispers along the sidewalk. I heard she'd hired a lawyer, not to sue, but to inquire about reinstatement and damages to her reputation. She'd taken her own suspension as an insult instead of a consequence. The report hadn't gone to trial yet, but the city attorney's office was moving slowly. That's when a notice arrived in every mailbox in the neighborhood. No HOA letterhead. No official stamp, just a black and white flyer printed in bold font. What really happened at the meeting, the truth HOA doesn't want you to hear. There was no name attached, but everyone knew. Inside was a twisted narrative, a list of events from Marla's perspective, claims that I had raised my voice, that I'd stood aggressively, that the board had turned against her out of fear. There was even a bullet point that said, unverified claims of PTSD behavior. I sat at my kitchen counter reading that sentence over and over until the ink felt etched into my skull. That was the moment I decided I was done staying quiet. The next morning, I wrote a letter, short, direct, respectful, and submitted it to Hazel for distribution through official HOA channels. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't angry, it simply stated facts. I had served 20 years. I moved here for peace. I followed every rule until the rules were used as weapons, and when I stood up for myself, I was assaulted and then slandered. I ended the letter with one line. I will not be defined by someone else's fear of losing power. Hazel called me an hour later. Her voice was tight. Are you sure you want to put this out there? I said yes. Then prepare yourself, she replied, because this will either quiet the noise or make you the loudest thing in it. She was right. But I wasn't afraid of noise anymore. I'd worn silence like armor for too long, and now I'd found my voice again, sharp, steady, and not for sale. The letter worked better than I expected. Within 2 days, it had circulated through every HOA member's inbox, and printed copies showed up on corkboards in the community center. I didn't intend for it to go viral, but the words hit a nerve. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to me in months suddenly stopped me during morning walks to say things like, we had no idea it was that bad, or I always thought something was off with Marla, but no one wanted to say anything. An older gentleman, Mr. Phelps, who had lived in the neighborhood since the early 90s, shook my hand with both of his. You said what a lot of us were too scared to, he told me. I appreciated the support, but I didn't bask in it. Truthfully, it unsettled me. Because it meant Marla's grip on this neighborhood had been tight for far longer than I'd realized, and people had been quietly suffering under the illusion of order. The more they praised me for speaking up, the more I wondered why it took a slap for them to stop whispering. Of course, Marla wasn't going down without flailing first. Her attorney sent a letter, thinly veiled and full of vague legal jargon, claiming that my statement had defamed her and further jeopardized her standing in the community. I passed it straight to Priya, a defense attorney friend of mine, for my final posting in San Diego. She was ruthless in the best way. This is all bark, she said, glancing through the document. She's hoping to intimidate you into withdrawing. We respond only with facts. We prepared a response packed with evidence, timestamps, witness statements, HOA meeting footage, and of course the original police report. The moment Marla realized we weren't bluffing, she shifted tactics again. She stopped talking about the SLAP and started spinning her past. The charity events she'd organized, the homes she helped protect from violations, the years of unpaid community service. Her campaign turned nostalgic. She wanted people to miss who she had been before she revealed who she really was. But the damage was done. The more she tried to tug on her legacy, the more people remembered the small invisible ways she'd made life harder for them. The fines for a trash bin out of place by 10 minutes, the letters about mailbox paint colors, the citations for wind chimes or solar lights or overgrown hedges. Everyone had a story. The difference now, they weren't afraid to share them. What once felt like a tight-knit community under a strong leader now looked more like a collection of quiet prisoners who'd forgotten how to breathe. Hazel began getting anonymous notes of support at her door. The new board members suggested a vote to revise the HOA's leadership terms, limiting presidential powers and capping terms, and at the next meeting, I was the one reading the agenda. Marla's chair remained empty, her nameplate removed. There was a pause at the start where Hazel looked around the room, half expecting a final tantrum, but there was only quiet. The kind you earn, not enforce. Still, I knew better than to think the war was over. Marla wasn't the type to retreat gracefully. She was the kind who waited for cracks, slipped through the smallest opening, and came back sharper. That's why when I received the subpoena notice taped to my door that Friday morning, I didn't flinch. Civil court. She was filing for emotional distress. Said the slap had been exaggerated. Said I'd weaponized community fear against her, that I'd damaged her personal safety and professional reputation. I stood on my porch in the early light, paper in hand, reading it twice. My hands didn't shake. My pulse didn't spike. I just went inside, made a fresh pot of coffee, and called Priya. She's going to try to drag this into the courtroom, I told her. Priya didn't miss a beat. Good, she said. Now we get to bring the truth into 1-2. The courthouse wasn't as intimidating as I expected. After everything that had unfolded in the past 2 months, it almost felt like neutral ground. No HOA banners, no whispering neighbors, no Marla glares flung from across the street, just polished floors, fluorescent lights, and the sharp, sterile hush of people waiting for judgment. Priya met me outside the hearing room, tablet in hand, hair pulled back like she was ready to dismantle an entire defense with one blink. She's not here yet, she said, glancing at the time, but her attorney is. You remember him? I nodded. He was the same guy who sent the veiled threat letter weeks back. I recognized the shoes first. Expensive, shined like they'd never touched pavement. We didn't speak, but he looked me over like I was already part of a story he intended to rewrite. I didn't care. I wasn't here to argue. I was here to testify. The civil suit Marla filed named me, Hazel, the HOA board, and even 2 residents who had commented publicly on her behavior. She claimed emotional distress, reputational harm, and loss of community status due to false allegations and conspiratorial targeting. Priya had warned me she'd go big, but this was pure spectacle. The judge, an older woman with gray eyes and a flat tone, didn't seem impressed. She read the file like she was scanning a grocery list. We're here for a preliminary review of evidence, she said plainly. This is not a trial, it's a procedural hearing. Still, Marla came in late dramatically. Silk blouse, large sunglasses, a cast on her wrist that hadn't existed a week ago. She didn't look at me once, but her body language screamed for attention. Stooped shoulders, labored sighs, shaking hands, theatrics. I didn't blink. I'd stood across from insurgents and read their tales like novels. Marla wasn't in pain. She was in panic. She was losing control, the only way she knew how, with drama, spin, and distraction. Priya presented our opening response in clean, surgical language. She laid out the sequence of events, the pattern of targeted citations, the slap, the witness statements, the board resignations. Then came the video, a shaky recording from a phone taken by a teenager seated in the back of the room during the HOA meeting. It wasn't perfect quality, but it caught the moment clearly. My words, Marla's march forward, and the slap. There was no sound after, just that suffocating silence. In the recording, you could see my jaw tighten, see me standing my ground without raising a finger. Then came her shout, "You can't arrest me!" That clip alone stripped her case to bone. Her attorney objected, claiming the video was contextually incomplete. But the judge waved it off. "You can't partially file a lawsuit and expect full admission of the incident in question," she said flatly. I watched Marla's face as she realized what was happening. She wasn't winning. She wasn't controlling the pace. She was being seen truthfully for the first time in years. After the hearing, the judge delayed ruling until the next session. Standard procedure, but Priya smiled on the way out. "She's rattled," she said. "She didn't expect that video. She didn't expect witnesses. She expected you to fold." I nodded but said nothing. Outside the courthouse, Hazel was waiting. She looked nervous until she saw me. Then her shoulders eased. "Thank you for not backing down," she said. She tried to tear this whole place apart, and for a while, I think she almost did. We stood there a moment, watching people pass in silence. I thought about the version of me that had first moved into Sutter Pines, the man who wanted quiet, who didn't want to fight anymore, who thought maybe, just maybe, after 2 decades in uniform, he'd earned peace. But peace, I'd learned, isn't always given. Sometimes you have to fight for it 1 inch at a time, even in a neighborhood with trimmed hedges and smiling saboteurs. Marla had brought me into a new kind of war. The difference now was, she'd underestimated who she was up against. After the hearing, things shifted in Sutter Pines. Not loudly. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where people rallied in the streets, but I felt it in smaller ways. People who had once looked through me now looked at me. The man who never waved finally nodded as he trimmed his hedge. 2 teenagers who had once crossed the street when I jogged past now walked their dog right down the middle of the sidewalk and waved without flinching. It wasn't praise, and I didn't want it to be. It was recognition. I'd stood my ground, and it hadn't made me dangerous. It made me visible. Hazel called a week after the hearing to say the board had received a record number of messages thanking us for cleaning up the culture. Her words, not mine. I told her the culture wasn't the problem. It was the permission they'd given someone like Marla to rule unchecked. Well, she said, no one's bowing anymore. She hesitated before adding, you've become something of a symbol, Cal, whether you wanted it or not. But I also didn't ignore what that meant, so I started showing up more, to meetings, to neighborhood cleanups, to quiet, mundane moments I used to avoid, not because I wanted attention, but because showing up is how you protect something once it starts healing. One evening, I volunteered to help repaint the fencing along the walking path behind the subdivision. A few neighbors came by to help, brushes in hand. Casual smiles passed around like coffee. One of them, a woman named Judith, said, I used to hate this place. Too many rules, too many eyes, but lately, it feels different. I didn't answer. Just dipped my brush in paint and kept working. Because healing doesn't need announcements. It just needs consistency. But even as the neighborhood began softening, Marla grew louder. Not physically, but digitally. Her social media posts became longer, angrier. Screenshots were passed around, shared in whispers. She hinted that she was being victimized, that people were turning on her like wolves. That's how power works when it's slipping. First denial, then blame, then martyrdom. Her legal team submitted another motion. This time, they wanted to drop the emotional distress claim and shift toward a defamation strategy targeting Hazel and the HOA board collectively. It's a fishing expedition, Priya said. She's trying to stir enough fear that someone breaks and settles, but the more she pivots, the worse she looks to the court. Still, the board was shaken. Hazel called a special meeting, private, off the record. I arrived to find her, the two other board members, and a handful of longtime residents sitting in a tight circle. They asked what we should do next. Do we push for a formal vote of no confidence in Marla? One of them asked. Do we issue a public statement again? I looked around the room, remembering how quiet they had been 2 months ago, and said, we don't react. We lead. We show up. We enforce fair rules. We listen. And we stop playing by her rules because she's already lost the room. Now she's just trying to burn it down on her way out. Hazel nodded slowly. Then we hold the vote, and we make it public. The vote was scheduled for the following week. It wasn't about her title. She'd already been suspended. This was about permanently removing her from eligibility to hold any leadership position within Sutter Pines. Ever. The turnout was bigger than expected. Residents filled every seat in the community center. Marla arrived 20 minutes late, arms crossed, chin high. But the room didn't freeze like it used to. It hummed with energy, sharp, quiet, expectant. Hazel stood at the podium and read the charges. Abuse of power, harassment, unprovoked violence, and malicious legal retaliation. Then, without ceremony, she opened the vote. Ballots were passed, pens scratched. When the counting was done, Hazel cleared her throat and read the results aloud. 91% in favor of permanent removal. Marla didn't flinch, didn't argue. She simply stood, adjusted her blazer, and walked out without a word. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt since before I ever moved in. Not victory, not vindication, just space. Like the air had cleared, like something heavy had finally lifted, and this time, it was never coming back down. The week after the vote felt like breathing for the first time in months. There were no surprise letters, no sideways glances at the mailbox, no distant murmurs from the walking path. Just stillness, the kind that doesn't make you tense up, the kind you trust. I spent most of that week in the backyard, planting sage, lavender, and a few low-maintenance succulents along the fence line. Something about having my hands in the soil. Something alive, growing, real, helped me understand that I hadn't just survived a fight. I'd reshaped the space around me. The neighborhood didn't feel like enemy territory anymore. It felt like something worth staying in. I caught myself humming while watering the plants one morning, and when I realized it, I smiled. Not because of the tune, but because it had happened naturally. No effort, just life, finally flowing again where tension used to live. Hazel stopped by that Friday evening with a small box in her hands. We found this in the HOA storage closet, she said, holding it out like it might break open. Inside were handwritten complaints that had never been formally filed. Notes from residents who had once tried to speak up about Marla and had been ignored, dismissed, or worse, penalized. Some were dated as far back as 5 years. One note was from a single mother who had been fined for leaving her child's bike on the front porch overnight. Another from a retired woman who had been reprimanded for displaying a handmade wreath too close to Easter. Hazel looked up at me, eyes tired. She didn't just silence people, she erased them. We sat on a patio with the box between us, flipping through the fragments of a neighborhood that had suffered in silence. It wasn't loud pain, it was the kind that makes people retreat inside themselves. You think people will trust leadership again, she asked. I thought about it and said, if they see us out here doing the work, not just holding the title, maybe. A few nights later, I hosted a community night. Nothing fancy, just folding chairs, pitchers of lemonade, and a projector screen to show an old black and white film under the stars. First, I thought maybe 5 or 6 people would come. By sundown, there were more than 30. Kids ran barefoot in the grass, neighbors brought snacks, Hazel made a fruit tray. It wasn't about celebration, it was about presence, about being somewhere without waiting for it to turn ugly, about claiming space without bracing for impact. An older woman I'd never met leaned over halfway through the movie and said, "It's been a long time since I felt comfortable sitting out at night like this." That stuck with me, not because I was proud, but because I realized how much fear had grown roots here without anyone noticing. The more we talked, the more I saw it wasn't just about HOA rules or power. It was about people slowly forgetting what freedom felt like. And maybe, just maybe, that freedom had to start small again. Under porches, under moonlight, with laughter and the smell of kettle corn. I went inside that night feeling something I hadn't felt since the day I signed the mortgage on the house. Home. Not just a structure, not just land, but a space where I could exist fully without proving myself or defending every inch. Marla was gone, but the damage she left behind was real. Still, what mattered more was what remained. Us. The neighbors who showed up. The ones who spoke. The ones who stayed even after things got hard. I poured myself a glass of water, stepped out onto the porch one last time before bed, and watched the last few guests leave. Someone called out, "Thanks for doing this, Cal." I gave a small wave, then looked up at the sky. It was quiet, not like silence that holds its breath, but the kind that makes room for recovery, for rest, for rebuilding. As I stood there, barefoot on my own wood-planked porch, I realized something I never thought I'd feel in this place again. Safe. Not because the fight was over, but because I no longer feared it. It came in a plain white envelope, no return address, just my name in clean, narrow handwriting. I found it tucked inside my mailbox early Monday morning, folded between a local ad flyer and a water bill. I didn't open it right away. I stood there on the sidewalk, envelope in one hand, coffee in the other, staring at the front gate like something had shifted without permission. I'd learned to trust those instincts in the Army, those quiet cues that something wasn't quite right. When I finally opened it, I didn't have to read far to know exactly who it was from. The wording was careful, legal sounding, a statement, not a conversation. "This correspondence is to notify you of my intention to pursue private mediation as a means of resolving the undue public damage caused to my personal and professional reputation during your tenure on the HOA board. Marla." Again, I folded the letter once and slid it into my back pocket, not because it rattled me, but because I knew what it meant. She wasn't done. She'd lost the votes, the court of public opinion, and her title. But like all people who confuse power with identity, she was trying to claw her way back into relevance. I took the letter straight to Priya. She read it, eyes scanning quickly, then scoffed. "She's bluffing again. Mediation only works if both parties agree to show up in good faith, and you've already shown more than that." I nodded. Still, "She's not going to stop until she runs out of fuel." "Then we make sure she runs out," Priya replied. "Let her call for mediation. We'll show up with everything. And if she dares push for any settlement, we'll counter with damages of our own. False accusations. Legal harassment. She wants an audience, but what she'll get is paperwork she can't squirm out of." I left her office more resolved than anxious. Still, a pit had opened in my chest again. Not fear, but fatigue. I'd won. Everyone knew I had. But Marla didn't care about truth. She cared about attention. She cared about the echo of control, even if it was only noise now. I had underestimated that kind of desperation before. I wouldn't do it again. That weekend, I went to the community garden near the back trail of Sutter Pines, a place Marla had once tried to shut down for being a misuse of communal space. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. It had since become a symbol of the neighborhood's quiet rebellion, small, persistent, and blooming. I brought a few extra tomato seedlings and spent the afternoon helping an older couple plant herbs in one of the raised beds. As we worked, the woman, her name was Clarice, said, "I don't know if you realize how much this place changed after you took a stand." I shook my head gently. I didn't take a stand to change the place. I just couldn't let it keep shrinking everyone. She smiled, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "That's the same thing, really." Her words stuck with me all day because I'd never wanted to be the face of anything. I just wanted to live without being punished for minding my own business. But now, somehow, I was holding a line that people had started to trust. And if Marla was trying to yank the rug out again, I had to decide whether I was going to brace for it or step forward. The following Tuesday, I received another letter, this time from the city attorney's office. They were formally closing the investigation into the HOA incident. No charges were being filed against me, no action would be taken against the board. But what mattered most was the final paragraph. While civil action remains the right of the complainant, we find no substantial evidence to support further claims of harassment, retaliation, or reputational harm as presented. That letter was more than a legal victory. It was the end of a shadow. I stood on my porch holding it, the sun climbing slowly over the rooftops, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I didn't feel like someone waiting for another blow. I felt like someone who had outlasted the storm. And in that moment, I knew if Marla wanted to keep swinging at ghosts, let her. I had a home, a name, and a neighborhood that had finally remembered what fairness looked like. And none of that could be taken away, not with letters, not with lawsuits, and definitely not with fear. 2 weeks passed with no new letters, no rumors, no late-night drama. It was the first time since the slap that I went more than a few days without looking over my shoulder, wondering what else Marla might try. I had the city's letter pinned on my fridge, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Sometimes truth doesn't shout. Sometimes it just stands firm long enough to be heard. The community was calmer, too. The board meetings were shorter. People started bringing their dogs again to the trail she once tried to shut down. One couple even repainted their front door teal, something she'd fined them for in the past. We were healing, inch by inch. But something else was creeping in, too, something familiar. A vacancy. Marla's absence had left a hole in the power structure, and people were starting to circle it like it was fresh meat. I started noticing small things, suggestions being slipped into HOA forms, whispers about streamlining the rulebook, and even a petition that arrived, unsigned but written with uncanny authority. The tone was eerily precise, confident, bureaucratic. It wasn't Marla's handwriting, but it sure smelled like her brand of control. Then Hazel called me. Her voice was tight, measured. "We've had someone express interest in joining the board permanently." "Okay," I said cautiously. "And?" She paused. Her name's Renee Porter. Newer resident, moved here 2 months ago, just after the vote. Quiet, but here's the thing. She's already submitted 3 formal complaints, one about noise, one about fence height, and one about, get this, your garden flag. I blinked. "The same one I've had since I moved in?" Hazel sighed. "Exactly." The implication was clear. Someone was either trying to fill Marla's shoes or was acting on her behalf. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the pattern was starting to write itself. I'd seen it before in other settings. Remove a toxic leader and, if you're not careful, their ghost slips into someone else's skin. I hung up the phone and sat in the kitchen, staring out the window at the back garden. The tomatoes were coming in heavy, the rosemary bushes were thick. Life was still growing here, but I'd be damned if I let another power-hungry stranger rot this place from the roots up. That night, I went through Renee's complaint history. Hazel had forwarded them. Clean formatting, carefully cited rules, polite tone, but unmistakably passive-aggressive. Each one was framed as concern, not accusation. But concern stacked often enough becomes control. I found myself rereading the 3rd complaint, the one about my flag. It wasn't just about height, it was about visible alignment with non-standard pole fixtures which disrupt aesthetic uniformity. I exhaled through my nose and shook my head. She wasn't concerned with neighborhood beauty, she was testing boundaries, just like Marla had. Start small, see who pushes back, and then twist compliance into quiet obedience. The difference now was, I wasn't new, and neither was the neighborhood. I wasn't going to fight her the way I fought Marla. I didn't need to. We'd already done the hard part, waking up. What came next was defense in the purest sense. protecting what we'd rebuilt with vigilance, not aggression. So I showed up at the next board meeting early, set up chairs, greeted people, stayed present. When Renee arrived, blonde bob, crisp white shirt, clipboard in hand, I stood and introduced myself before she could sit. Cal Riggins, I said. I understand you're interested in the board. Her smile was sharp. Just here to support the rules, Mr. Riggins. Every good community needs structure. I nodded slowly. Structure's good. So is clarity. We don't enforce personal preference here. We enforce fairness. She blinked, smile still frozen. Of course. The meeting began. Hazel went through updates, budget, standard items. Then Renee raised her hand. I'd like to formally submit my interest in the open board seat, she said. No surprise, she handed Hazel a typed letter, but then she turned and addressed the room. There's been a lot of change here recently. I think it's time we restore a little order. The word restore hit the air like a slow leak. I watched faces shift, people remembering how that word was once weaponized. I didn't say anything then. I didn't need to, because before Hazel could respond, another hand went up, then another, then three more. I'd like to be considered too, someone said. Me as well, said another. The room didn't clap, but it woke up. Renee didn't speak much after the meeting ended. She stood near the back of the room, lips tight, eyes flicking between the neighbors she thought were beneath her and the ones now standing beside them. It was subtle, but I recognized the twitch in her jaw. Marla had it too, that same disappointment when control didn't arrive on cue. I stuck around until the last chair was folded, chatting with a few of the newer residents. Hazel lingered, a rare smile softening her otherwise tired eyes. Did you see the way they spoke up, she asked. They didn't hesitate, not one bit. I nodded, rubbing the back of my neck. They finally realized they don't need someone to fight for them. They just needed someone to remind them how to stand. Hazel tilted her head and said, You're doing more than standing, Cal. You're leading, even if you never meant to. I didn't respond to that. I didn't have to, because leadership wasn't what I came here for. It wasn't what I wanted. But if the only thing keeping another Marla from rising was my presence, then I'd hold that line as long as they needed me. The applications came in over the next few days. 5 residents, 3 of them people who had never attended a meeting before, submitted their names for the open board seat. No one said it out loud, but it was clear this wasn't about HOA politics anymore. It was about ownership, of peace, of fairness, of the right to live without fear of weaponized rules. Renee's tone shifted. She started walking the neighborhood more, smiling too brightly, trying to appear involved. I saw her pick up a neighbor's knocked-over trash can one morning, then immediately take a photo of it upright. Probably for her online post about being a proud protector of community standards. It was performative. People saw through it. We'd all seen that act before. What she didn't understand was that we were no longer afraid of order. We just refused to let it become something we bowed to. We respected structure, yes, but not thrones. That weekend, I hosted another movie night. No flyers, no announcements, just a few texts, a simple group chat Hazel had started, in a sheet pinned to a tree with a handwritten 8 p.m. projector, snacks, lawn chairs. And still more than 40 people showed up. No drama, no agendas, just community. Kids chasing fireflies, parents passing lemonade, a young couple sitting under a blanket like the world couldn't touch them. At one point, I looked around and realized something unexpected. People weren't just watching the movie. They were watching each other, checking in, catching up, being neighbors in a way this place hadn't seen in years. Renee walked by at the edge of the event. She didn't come in, just paused across the street, arms folded. She wasn't excluded. She was uncomfortable. Because power, real power, wasn't something she could script. This time, it was already spoken for, in gestures and laughter, in the calm that didn't need to prove itself. And that night, sitting on my porch steps with a half-empty glass of iced tea, I realized something else. I wasn't guarding peace anymore. I was finally part of it. A few days later, Hazel texted me. She dropped out. No explanation, no announcement, just a short email from Renee stating that she was no longer seeking the board seat. Hazel said it came just an hour after the vote was officially scheduled. She read the room, Hazel said, and it didn't read back the way she thought it would. I reread the message twice. There was no celebration in it, no gloating, just closure. Because people like Renee and Marla before her don't usually go quietly. But when a community learns to stand together, the noise they once feared turns into background static. That evening, I walked the neighborhood again. Not to patrol, not to worry, just to be present. Lawn lights flickered on one by one, dogs barked from fenced yards, sprinklers clicked on, soaking small flower beds, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was recovering from something. I felt like I was returning to something better, something earned. And in the quiet between steps, I whispered, "We're not afraid of order anymore, but we'll never mistake it for freedom again." I didn't expect to see her again. Not in person, not after the vote, not after the lawsuit collapsed under its own weight and her name faded from inboxes, flyers, and whispered conversations. But on a Thursday afternoon in late spring, I saw her car roll slowly past the community center as I sat on a bench out front. Same silver sedan. Same spotless exterior. It turned the corner like it was afraid to commit. Then it circled back once, twice, and on the third pass, it pulled into the parking lot. I didn't stand, I didn't wave, I just watched. The engine cut, the door opened, and there she was, Marla Denning, former self-appointed queen of Sutter Pines, standing beneath the sun like it owed her warmth. She wore dark glasses, beige slacks, and a blouse that probably cost more than anything in my closet. Her posture was still tall, but it had changed. Less regal, more cautious. She saw me and froze for just a second, just long enough for that flicker of recognition to shift into something else. Not shame, not pride, just the discomfort of being remembered by someone who knows your worst day. She didn't come to talk. She walked past me like I was invisible, which would have worked if she hadn't paused at the bulletin board outside the center. There, beneath laminated notices and summer event flyers, was a single printed page, "Meet your board." Our names were listed. Hazel, Antonio, me. She read it, then turned. "You stayed," she said softly. Her voice had lost its edge, no sneer, no authority, just a woman trying to figure out how the ground shifted beneath her while she wasn't looking. I nodded. "I live here," I replied. "You did too," she gave a humorless smile. "I kept it in line." "You kept it under control," I corrected. "And there's a difference." She didn't argue, just lowered her sunglasses a little and scanned the playground nearby, children laughing, parents watching from shaded benches, life happening without her input. "You think you've made it better?" she asked, almost amused. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at the kids, then at the flowers around the fence she once petitioned to remove. "I think we've made it ours." She flinched at that, barely, but enough. "You always had that tone," she said, stepping closer, "like you were so certain you were right, even when you were new, even when you didn't understand what this place needed." I stood slowly, not to confront but to be level with her. What it needed was room to breathe. She opened her mouth like she might argue, then stopped herself. She looked around one more time, slower this time, like she was trying to memorize the version of Sutter Pines that no longer answered to her. "I didn't come to cause trouble," she said. "I just wanted to see it." I believed her. And that was the strange part, because if she had come to provoke, she would have come louder. She would have had a petition or a clipboard or a speech. But this was someone who had lost her reflection in a place that no longer mirrored her back. She turned to leave, but stopped once more. "You're not as quiet as you think you are, Cal." "I'm not quiet," I said. I'm finished being ignored. She gave a tight nod, then walked back to her car. She didn't look back. I watched her drive away, slow, cautious, measured, like she was leaving something sacred, something she hadn't realized mattered until it slipped through her fingers. She didn't wave. She didn't need to, because the wave had already happened months ago, the kind you never return from. That evening, I didn't mention her to anyone, didn't post about it, didn't bring it up at the board meeting. Her power was gone, and I wasn't about to resurrect it by making noise. Instead, I walked the trail behind the houses where her name used to make people tense up. I passed by a small group planting new perennials, a teen repainting one of the bike racks, an older man filling bird feeders. Life went on without her, and it would keep doing so. That was the real win. She came back to a place that no longer flinched when it saw her, and I stayed in a place that finally saw me for what I was. Not the threat, not the soldier, not the problem, just a neighbor who decided he'd rather be trusted than feared. The thing about peace is that it doesn't always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it just slips into your daily routine without ceremony, no ribbon, no headline, just a quiet understanding that you're no longer holding your breath. I felt it one morning as I stood watering the plants along my fence, watching the sun catch the edges of the rosemary. The neighborhood was calm, familiar, but not small. It was starting to feel like home again, not just for me, but for others who once tiptoed through it like they were trespassing on someone else's expectations. Hazel had mentioned at the last board meeting that new families were moving in steadily, drawn not by the houses themselves, but by the stories. Stories of a place that had once been rigid and sharp and had learned to soften. I didn't think of myself as part of that story at first, but now it was hard to deny. I was still getting notes in my mailbox, not complaints, just little thank you cards for standing up when we couldn't, for reminding us we belong here, for proving quiet doesn't mean weak. I kept them in a drawer near my keys, didn't show them to anyone, but I read them, every one. One afternoon, Hazel stopped by again, this time with something different, a clipboard with a proposed amendment to the HOA charter. "It's time to think about future-proofing," she said, handing it to me. "We've seen what happens when power has no expiration date. I think we need term limits." I nodded slowly. It made sense. I flipped through the proposal. Clear language, good structure, enforceable boundaries. It was the kind of protection we hadn't known we needed until it was too late. Hazel looked at me, her expression unreadable for a moment. "Have you thought about whether you'll stay on after this term?" she asked. I hesitated. "Not really." "Maybe you should," she said. "Or maybe," she paused, "maybe you've already done what you needed to do." I sat with that. The idea that leadership could have an exit, that sometimes staying too long could become its own form of control, even if your intentions were pure. I looked out the window toward the street where kids now played without nervous glances over their shoulders. "I think I came here to rest," I said finally, "and ended up rebuilding something instead. Maybe it's time I let it stand on its own." That night, I made a list, not of tasks or policies, but people. Neighbors who had stepped up, residents who had shown up when it mattered, names I hadn't known 6 months ago, but now associated with courage, patience, presence. I started imagining what the board would look like without me in it, not as a vacuum, but as an evolution. Could someone else hold the line now? Would the culture stay true? Then I remembered what Hazel said. We're not afraid of order anymore, and I realized something. This neighborhood didn't need a defender now. It needed a gardener, someone who could prune, support, and help new leaders grow. And maybe that wasn't me anymore. I didn't feel regret when I thought about stepping away. I felt relief, not because I was tired, but because the burden no longer needed to be carried by one person. That's the thing about leadership no one tells you. It's not measured by how long you stand in the spotlight. It's measured by how well the people you stood for learned to stand on their own. I didn't announce anything that night. I didn't write a speech or send out an email, but I knew that I was preparing to hand something over, not with hesitation, but with pride, because I hadn't come here to control anything. I'd come here to breathe, and somewhere along the way, I helped others do the same. That was enough. That was more than enough. As I sat on my porch, listening to the sprinklers tick on and the crickets hum low beneath the bushes, I watched the last light drain from the sky. The neighborhood lights flickered on, one by one, steadier than before, softer. I leaned back in my chair, glass in hand, and smiled to myself, not because of what I had built, but because of what I no longer had to fix. That's how I knew I had done enough, and maybe soon it would be time to walk a little slower, speak a little less, and let someone else carry the torch. After all, what good is peace if it still depends on one person keeping it? I didn't announce it at the next board meeting, not officially. I just sat through the agenda like always, reviewed budgets, nodded at landscaping updates, approved a motion to update the bylaws, and waited for the right moment. It came near the end after the usual shuffle of papers and stretching of backs when Hazel asked if anyone had other business to raise. I looked up. "I think it's time I step down after this term," I said. My voice didn't waver. No fanfare, no dramatics, just the truth. The room went still. Hazel blinked. Antonio leaned forward. "You sure?" he asked. I nodded. "I came here looking for quiet. I think I finally found it. And I trust you all to keep it that way." No one tried to change my mind. No one needed to. Because what came next was better. Real acknowledgement, not flattery. "You gave people room to breathe," Hazel said quietly, "and now they know how to keep breathing without permission." I didn't smile, but something inside me eased, because that's the legacy I'd hoped for. Not a plaque, not a title, just a rhythm that could carry on without me. After the meeting, I lingered in the courtyard outside the center. The night air was soft. The breeze smelled like cut grass and distant barbecue. People trickled out slowly, and a few stayed behind to talk. Renee was there, not in challenge, but in curiosity. She approached cautiously, the competitive edge gone from her voice. "I read your resignation draft," she said. "It was generous." I shrugged. "Truth doesn't need sharp corners," she nodded, watching a couple of kids dart across the grass under dim lamplight. "You think someone like me could have done this differently?" she asked. It wasn't bait, it was sincere. I thought for a second before answering. If you walk into leadership thinking it's about control, it changes you. But if you show up willing to listen, people give you something stronger than control. They give you trust. Earn that, and you don't need much else. She didn't reply. But her expression shifted, just slightly, less defensive, more open. She said goodnight, and I watched her walk toward her house like someone who had finally started looking inward instead of outward. The rest of the month moved quietly. I spent more time on small things, helping an elderly neighbor fix a broken gate, repainting the trail signs with a volunteer group, sitting in on a local veteran outreach event at the library. Life slowed without feeling empty. That's how I knew I had made the right choice. People still called me sir sometimes, old habits, I guess. But now came with a different tone, less reverence, more familiarity, not fear, not distance, just shared respect. Hazel finalized the charter amendments and scheduled a proper election for the open board seats. For the first time in years, multiple candidates signed up, and not out of ambition, but investment. They cared. Really cared. And that mattered more than any uniform ever had. One of the candidates, a soft-spoken guy named Jordan, came by one evening to ask about my thoughts on conflict resolution. "You seem like someone who knows how to keep people from blowing up," he said. I laughed. "Let them talk. Don't flinch when they're angry, and never confuse silence with surrender." He scribbled that down like it was scripture. I didn't stop him. On the night before the community election, I stood on my porch again, hands in my jacket pockets, eyes fixed on the street I once saw as a battlefield. Now it looked like something closer to what I'd always wanted. A place that could hold people as they were, no armor required. A couple walked by and waved. The teenager across the street was playing guitar again, this time without headphones. Someone had lit citronella candles near the community benches. I didn't feel like the guardian anymore. I felt like a neighbor. And that shift, that unspoken handoff, was worth more than any applause. I exhaled slowly and said more to the wind than to myself, "Let them keep it now." Not because I was finished with them, but because they had finally learned how to carry it themselves. Tomorrow I'd cast my vote, shake a few hands, and leave the meeting through the side door without looking back. Because some chapters don't need dramatic endings, just a door left unlocked for the right people to walk through next. Election day came without fanfare, no campaign speeches, no front yard signs, no tension humming in the air like it used to. Just people arriving early with folding chairs and water bottles, smiling politely as they filled out ballots under the community center's faded awning. I didn't wear anything different. No button-up, no jacket, just jeans and the same ball cap I'd had since my last deployment. I walked up quietly, greeted Hazel with a nod, and slipped my vote into the box like it was any other form. She gave me a look that held more than words. "You sure you don't want to say anything before we close it out?" she asked. I smiled gently, already said everything that needed saying, and I meant it. What mattered now wasn't my voice echoing in a room, it was their voices taking shape. When the count was done, Jordan won the seat, clean honest, by a margin that told me this wasn't about popularity, it was about trust. He looked stunned, grateful, a little scared. I pulled him aside after the announcement. "You don't need to know everything," I told him. "Just stay steady. People will tell you what they need. Just make sure you listen." I didn't stick around long after that, slipped out the side door as planned. No spotlight, no long goodbye, just the quiet satisfaction of leaving something better than I found it. On the walk home, the neighborhood looked different, not because the houses had changed, but because the fear had drained out of them. There were welcome signs again on porches, wind chimes that used to get flagged for noise violations, even a row of solar lanterns flickering under a trellis someone built near the walking trail. I remembered a time not long ago when all those things would have earned warning letters. Now they earned compliments. I passed a group of kids setting up a lemonade stand and dropped a $5 bill into their cup. "Huh, that's too much," one of them yelled. I grinned. "Then keep the change and call it peace tax." He laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. That sound stayed with me the rest of the walk. Joy didn't need permission anymore. It was just here. Living, breathing, finally free. That night, I sat on the porch with the house dark behind me. No TV on, no porch light, just me, the crickets, and the sound of wind threading through the olive tree in the yard. For a long time, I thought I needed to protect this place with the same instinct I carried from service. Eyes sharp, back straight, always waiting for the next threat. But maybe I'd been wrong about what protection really looked like. Maybe it wasn't about building walls. Maybe it was about opening gates, letting people see they weren't alone, letting them know someone would stand beside them until they could stand on their own. I didn't want a war in Sutter Pines. I didn't even want one. But I stayed through it. And sometimes that's enough. Not every legacy needs a headline. Sometimes the best kind is just a ripple in the quiet, long after you've stepped away. A few days later, I took the long road out of the neighborhood. No destination, just a drive. I passed the streets I used to jog, the community center now run by voices other than mine, the mailbox where so much drama used to begin. I slowed in front of Marla's old house. It was for sale again. Fresh paint, new flowers, clean slate. Someone would move in soon, and they'd never know what happened here. They just know the place felt peaceful, and that would be enough. That's how I wanted to leave it. Without needing credit, without needing thanks, just calm, the kind that lasts. I turned the corner and drove on, the windows down, the breeze warm against my face. I had come to Sutter Pines to disappear, but instead I found something better. I found people. I found purpose, and then I let it go. Because real strength isn't in how long you hold the line. It's in knowing when to hand it over, step back, and trust it won't fall. If you've ever been pushed, silenced, or underestimated just for trying to live in peace, then you know sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand your ground and then step back when the job is done. Paid for power, I fought to breathe, and in the end, the silence that followed was the loudest message of all. If stories like this speak to you, real ones, about quiet justice, earned peace, and dignity that doesn't need to shout, subscribe. There are more true stories on the way. Tap the bell so you're there the moment they realize they were never in charge of you to begin with.